Hi, I'm JT McGill,
And I'm Dan Marshall.
and this is our engine project.
So what we're going to be modeling in this report is the twin oscillating boxer steam engine. It's a two-piston steam engine that drives a flywheel.
Alright, let's get into the parts first. The first part we have is the wooden base, and it really only has two distinguishing features. The first is the two pilot holes drilled in the top to accommodate the wood screws that holds the frame to the base, and then the second is the chamfer that runs around three of the four top edges, and that's about it.
All right, our second part is the base frame. This is a brass bent plate that's kind of the spine of the whole model. You can see there's the smaller portion that has two holes. Those screw directly into the wood frame that we saw in part one. And the other part, the wider part with all the holes, is used to mount a lot of the rest of the structure.
Alright, this part is kind of only called Big End, but what it really is the journal for the piston rods, essentially. It's what connects the pistons to the crank throws. It's made almost entirely out of radiuses, and it's soldered onto the end of the piston pin rather.
Right, our fourth part is the crank bearing. This tube is soldered into the base frame that we saw in part two, and this is basically where the crankshaft runs through while it spins.
Alright, part 5 is the crank plate. There are actually two of these in the final assembled engine, and both of them solder onto the end of the crank shaft that attaches to the flywheel. And these are here to hold the crank pins or the crank throws on which the pistons connect. So this is kind of what makes the crank part of the crankshaft.
Right, so part six is our crankshaft. This, of course, is what links the pistons and the crank plates to the flywheel. So it basically just transfers that rotational motion over to the flywheel.
This is the first of the crank pins. It sits between the two crank plates and connects the first piston to the crankshaft. It has neck down on both ends, which are soldered into the crank plates. That's kind of how it fits together.
All right, this is our second crank pin, similar in function to the first crank pin, but this one links the outermost plate and the outermost piston together.
Part 9 is the cylinder. There's actually two of these in the assembled engine, and they solder on to the cylinder block assembly. The hole that's bored through the cylinder is how the cylinder is pressurized and depressurized through the ports that the block slides over while the engine is actually reciprocating. This is where obviously the piston runs and where the power is generated in the engine.
Alright, so this part here is the cylinder block. You can see it's got that indent in the top. That's for mounting the cylinder to. This also mounts to the frame. It links the cylinder to the frame. And you'll see it actually will pivot in order to change where the port goes, whether it's an inlet or an outlet.
Alright, this is part 11, the cylinder block stud, and it connects to the cylinder block in one of the holes that you saw bored in it in the previous slide. And it pokes through the frame of the engine, and then on the opposite side where you see those threads, a spring is basically fed over the threads and a nut is secured on it to hold it and allow it to pivot while still sealing with the ports.
So this is the flywheel for the engine. This is where all the rotational power of the pistons go to in the end. It gets the rotational power from the crankshaft, and that's what spins. It's the main output of the engine.
This is the piston. Just like with the cylinders, there are two of them in the engine, and these are what actually reciprocate up and down in the cylinders and, create the power that it sends through the piston stems to the crank and the flywheel.
Alright, this is a piston stem. All this basically does is it connects the piston that we saw in the last slide to the big end, the part that loops around the crank pins so that it can transfer power to the crank shaft.
Alright, this is the first stiffening plate. As you're going to see later when we get into the assemblies, this solders between the main frame of the engine and the crank bearing and just gives it some rigidity. There's two of them on the engine, and they just kind of help hold the thing together.
Right, this is the second stiffening plate in the assembly. Very similar in function to the first stiffening plate, but whereas the stiffening plate, the first one kind of holds it in the left and right direction, this one goes underneath between the crank bearing and the wooden base. That just keeps it from bobbing up and down.
Alright, these are the springs. As I mentioned before, these slide over the cylinder block stud and are held on with some sort of locking fastener. And they keep constant pressure and keep the cylinder block mated to the frame while still allowing it to reciprocate.
Alright, so this top block here, this mounts to the other side of the base frame from where the cylinder block is. You see those two holes in the front? Those are ports. As mentioned earlier, the cylinder block tilts up and down, and the porthole moves up and down. Those two holes there will match up with those portholes, whether it's taking in steam or letting out steam. So these basically just extend the ports out through the crank plate, or sorry, the mounting plate, and then a little bit farther, so you can put stuff there.
All right, parts 19 and 20 are miscellaneous fasteners. These are off-the-shelf catalog parts, but the two screws you see there are wood screws, and then the nuts are the lock nuts that are going to hold the springs onto the cylinder block studs. These are necessary for assembly, but not to be catted.
All right, so now we're going to move on to the sub-assemblies for the project. The first one we have is the base, the twin oscillator base. You'll see all the you get your base plate, all the stiffeners, the crankshaft, or I'm sorry, the crankshaft bearing, and then the wooden base. This is just kind of the skeleton of the part. This is where all the moving parts are mounted to. These will all stay static during operation.
All right, so this assembly is the flywheel, the crankshaft, the two crank plates, and the crank pin. As you can kind of see, they fit together here and are soldered together. This hole goes into the first crank pin, into this hole, and then the second crank pin goes into this lower hole here, and they all solder together and transmit the torque essentially to the flywheel.
All right, so this assembly here, our third assembly, is the cylinder block assembly. So you can see the cylinder there, as well as the mounting plate, and then that stud we talked about before that it pivots around. So this is basically where the piston will slide into, and the structure that mounts the piston to the main body.
Alright, this is the first piston, and you can see it's got a 45-degree angle cut on the head of the piston. That is to clear the port so that steam can pressurize the cylinder and effectively move the piston up and down. There's also a bend in the piston stem there. That is to align the big end with the appropriate crank throw.
Alright, this is the second piston. Looks very similar to the first one. The only difference is going to be the direction that stem is facing, the bend anyway. Basically, it's just switched so that the piston is offset, so it can get to the second big end and crank pin, so that, they're not conflicting with each other. Okay, this is kind of.
Alright, and now to wrap it up, we're going to look at the total engine and the whole assembly and how it fits together. Alright, this is the final assembly of the whole engine, and you can see here, the flywheel and crankshaft fit through that bearing, and then that goes clean through the frame, and how the cylinder blocks are mounted on the studs with the springs. So this is how it's all going to fit together in the end.
Alright, so this is the assembly again, only this time it's been broken down into all of those sub-assemblies we showed earlier. Here you can roughly see where everything kind of lines up and what its function is. You got your pistons and your piston cylinders in the back, and you got your frame, and then on the other end you have your flywheel, and then you have the shaft that would kind of pass through if it were fully assembled. And off to the side there we also have our springs, our nuts that would retain that.
Alright, and then just to kind of break it down even further, this is a fully disassembled, all of the parts are exploded and separate from each other view of the engine. So you can kind of see, this is all of the constituent parts that would be used to make this engine in real life. And so we got, everything from flywheel to stiffening plates to piston pins, everything. Alright, so this is a render of the engine in the sort of place that it might actually be if we were to build it. We have two of these, and we're gonna use this as an opportunity to talk about group dynamic. So I guess Daniel will start us off.
Sure. So our group dynamic actually worked very well for this project. It honestly was to the point where we didn't have to delegate. Both of us were pretty willing to knock out a bunch of stuff just on our own time. We both enjoy CAD enough where we kind of sit down and just knock off a whole lot of stuff without needing to make any kind of hard schedule. So overall, it works pretty good. We got all of our parts done almost instantaneously when it came time to do the draft drawings. We got that done in very short order. And overall, it was a very good dynamic. We had really good communication whenever we needed to coordinate who was doing what part to make sure we didn't end up doing the same one at the very least. We needed files to be transferred. Every other day we just make sure if we needed them, we had them by transferring them with a flash drive. Overall, it was a very, very efficient, very smooth way to do a project. I don't know how well it would scale to a larger group per se. because it's just like a kind of me and JT's dynamic. But for this project, it was excellent. It was a very pleasant project to work on, as well as very productive.
Yeah, certainly. And the only weird thing about it was kind of the way we ended up doing the parts as far as timing was concerned. Because, both of us basically did it when we had time. And so that led to a really weird, like, when the project was assigned, Daniel did most of the actual parts modeling. And that was done in like a week from when the project was assigned. And
Yes,
so we kind of
yes.
sat on a bunch of parts that were done. And then, as we approached the final date, we kind of got closer and closer to, like, realizing we needed to work on it, and then I did a whole mess of part drawings, and we got it all together in plenty of time. So it wasn't necessarily a problem. It was just an interesting way
Interesting
to
way of doing
allocate
it. Yep.
allocate
Yeah.
time. But I think that's perfectly fair for the group size, and it definitely it worked out in the end. I think we did okay. But yeah, it was a successful project.
Good project.
All right, so this kind of concludes our presentation. We hope our work was satisfactory, and we look forward to seeing you at the end of spring break.